Cross the rainbow bridge of Asgard, where the booming heavens roar. You'll behold in breathless wonder the God of thunder, mighty Thor.
Hello, listeners. Welcome back to the Washington Babylon podcast. We've had a busy month that has taken us off the air while we were taking care of some technical matters. You've probably noticed some of them, including the absence of several older episodes from the podcast feed. Don't worry, we have those audio files archived and we'll have them online very shortly. In the meantime, we have a great episode this week featuring some killer interviews. So take it away, Ken. Our first guest today is Whitney Webb, a reporter and analyst with Mint Press News.
Whitney, it's great to have you on the podcast. I have been reading lots of your coverage of the Intercept, and I've been a longtime critic of that publication myself, which most of our listeners will be familiar with. But I wanted to ask you, first I want to ask you, tell us a little bit about yourself and your publication, and then I'll go to the questions about the Intercept.
Okay, sure. Well, thanks for having me on your podcast. My name is Whitney. I am a staff writer for Mint Press News. I've been with Mint Press since 2017. Mint Press, we like to consider ourselves watchdog journalism, holding the powerful accountable and all that and whatnot, which is probably why we, for a long time, have really tried to hold the Intercept's feet to the fire, so to speak, because they claim to do the same sort of thing, but they engage in a lot of behavior that, doesn't really fit with how they sell themselves and in their public image, right? But at Mint Press, we try really hard, to hold the powerful to account and be, report on things that, corporate media don't cover generally.
Well, that's what we try to do at Washington Babylon as well. I mean, and I think it was Orwell, who I'm not always a fan of, but sometimes, and I could be wrong, but I think he's the one who said, if that's not what you're doing, if you're not taking on powerful people and powerful interests, then you're a public relations official and not a journalist. So,
yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. So what sort of behavior, when you talk about the Intercept, what sort of behavior are you talking about in particular? And I mean, I have a pretty good idea since I've been reading your stuff, but for our listeners who haven't been, what's going on at the Intercept?
All right, so there's actually a lot of different angles here. So one major angle that I've been writing about recently, because of what's happened recently, is how there has been this troubling trend. I mean, now it's totally fair to call it a trend of sources being outed by the Intercept. And even though it is definitely true that the Trump administration is continuing what the Obama administration really began in earnest of prosecuting whistleblowers under the Espionage Act, the Intercept has made a lot of decisions there, or staff of the Intercept have made decisions there that have directly led to people being outed. The most well-known case, of course, is the first one, which was Reality Winner. And that, according to, whistleblower lawyer Jesselyn Raddick and some other people, was the result of a reporter who handled the document that Winner leaked, Matthew Cole, who was actually hired by the Intercept after he had played a major role in sending John Kiriakou to prison. Of course, John Kiriakou is the CIA whistleblower who exposed the illegal torture program and the only person to serve prison time in relation to that program, right? So I think that's a red flag early on. Oh, sorry.
Whitney, I just want to interject just for a second, just to emphasize, not to break your flow, but even though you said it, to emphasize, Matthew Cole was hired after outing John Kiriakou.
Right.
When he worked for ABC. The Intercept hired him after he achieved that dubious distinction. Anyway, keep going. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's totally fine. But I think the fact that Matthew Cole was hired so early on was a really big red flag. And it's also come out more recently that Sam Biddle, around the same time that Matthew Cole was hired, had also been involved in sending Barrett Brown to prison based on what Barrett Brown has been saying recently. Which, makes it appear that this sort of behavior is not a new phenomenon beginning in 2017 with the prosecution of Reality Winner. But and of course, the second whistleblower that was outed, that was Terry Albury, who was an FBI agent in Minneapolis, I believe. He had sent documents to the Intercept, and the government didn't know who the source was until the Intercept staff at the Intercept, they had attempted to basically launder the leaks by issuing Freedom of Information Act requests about the documents they'd already received. And what they had done in these requests is that they had included information that was not in the public record. So that led the FBI to believe that they had already obtained the documents and were just trying to cover it up, which in fact was the case, and that led them to investigate who had access to these documents, because Terry Albury didn't print them out. He just took screenshots, right? And so that led them to Terry Albury, and he's in prison currently as well, serving a 4-year sentence. Reality Winner is serving a 5-year sentence. Now we have Daniel Hale, which I think is another very interesting case for a different reason. So Daniel Hale was indicted just recently, but he was actually known to the federal government as a possible leaker as early as 2014, because they raided his house in August of 2014 in connection with the fact that he had printed off documents that were later published by The Intercept, and he was known to have made public appearances with Jeremy Scahill. The reason, and we can get into this later, that you want, the theory that a plausible theory that I have considered is that the reason the indictment has come now is that they have convinced Jeremy Scahill to testify against Daniel Hale. And I assume that not only because of Jeremy Scahill's silence, but also the fact that they waited so long to indict, and based on the current indictment, it's really clear that they don't have any of the encrypted messages between Scahill and Hale that they reference, or the content of the calls made. And I think the reason they waited to indict was until they had something more conclusive to go after Hale on, and I think that could very potentially be Jeremy Scahill testifying, especially due to the fact that there is a narrative in this indictment that suggests that Scahill sort of goaded Hale by looking over his resume and stuff before he was hired by a defense contractor to leak information to Scahill once he was hired by this outlet, which is really similar to the indictment against Julian Assange right now in relation to Chelsea Manning. They're trying to go, this is the basis, the public basis anyway, for Julian Assange's extradition to the United States, and they could easily make the same case against Scahill. So I think it's very possible that Scahill may testify against Hale. But of course, it hasn't come out yet, and that could be wrong. But that seems to explain the 5-year delay in prosecuting Daniel Hale. And there's other things too about the Intercept. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I cut in for a second?
Totally.
Yeah. Well, one, whether your theory is correct or not, we'll wait and see. But I expect it is. Based on what you're saying and based on what I know about Jeremy Scahill is a rat stink. I had the mispleasure of working with Scahill. He is a horrible, evil little troll and completely untrustworthy. And I'm going to float an idea to you that you may think is crazy, but I wrote this 4 to 6 to 8 weeks ago. And I'm going to tell you my theory, but I'm also going to tell you there's a fourth victim of the Intercept that you haven't mentioned. My theory is that the Intercept is an intelligence operation with the witting or unwitting collaboration of some of the staff, probably the unwitting collaboration of most. Pierre Omidyar is a tech oligarch, totally tied into the government, totally in bed with the government.
Absolutely.
In various overseas projects, through the National Endowment for Democracy and his own democracy network, this bullshit NGO that he spreads money around to pro-U.S. Forces in Ukraine, I believe in Venezuela, although I'm not sure about that, but in key hotspots, Omidyar is shoveling out money. I'm sure I would bet, I can't say for sure, but I would bet he's helping the CIA in Iran, because of course he is Iranian American. He is a rat. I have to say, I detest Jeff Bezos. I am very unfond of Bill Gates. Steve Jobs, not hugely a fan of, but all three of those guys built real organizations and built real products that I'm sitting here talking to you on an iPhone because I find it superior to the Android product. Androids are cheaper. Apple makes, in my view, a superior product. I am not a big fan of Microsoft products, but what I'm getting at is Pierre Omidyar is a half-wit. He was a guy who was lucky. He was in the right place at the right time. eBay is like AOL. It's sort of a joke. He was in early. He's not rich.
Right.
In my view, he was approached by U.S. intelligence and asked to set up a front group that would look like an independent crusading journalism outfit, pay a lot of reporters like me. I got paid a huge salary before I quit in disgust and fury to not produce work, but more importantly, to serve as a central clearinghouse for leakers and whistleblowers. And they would then, some of them, I'm not sure all of them, Scahill, in my view, is too stupid to be a witting collaborator. I mean, he was probably duped.
I don't know. I think he may be a part of it because he's really shown that he's very interested in the celebrity aspect that his role in the Intercept has given him. And a lot of people have written about this. Doug Valentine is one who's published some things on Counterpunch about, his documentaries are very, very focused on himself and even, a lot of the reporting. And some of his movies are actually based on reporters' work that other reporters did that he doesn't even name in the film, and he makes it all about him.
Absolutely. I mean, I actually remember on his Facebook page, I mean, Dirty Wars was a joke. I never saw it because I detest Scahill, but I had the misfortune of seeing the trailer, and it may as well be titled The Jeremy Scahill Story, by and about Jeremy Scahill. But I remember my son was about 9 years old, and I showed him a picture of Scahill on his Facebook page where he was doing the reverse peace sign with some Somali sheikh or something. And my son immediately just said, "What a tool and a fool."
Okay.
And he was 9. So, my son was smart. He wised up to Scahill before I did. Although I thought Scahill was a clown at the time. I'm just saying, I mean, it's pretty evident he is a clown. And he was chasing celebrity, appearing on any TV show that would have him. But the victim of those, in my view, who you've left out is Edward Snowden, and which also fits into a chronology and a theory that the Intercept was an intel operation and that Glenn was probably in on it. I mean, the only thing that clears Glenn is that he was so lazy. He's such a shitty reporter that Snowden had to beg him, and he almost, to take the documents, and he almost lost the story. So you might say, he was just an inept, lazy. He was never a reporter. I mean, he's a bloviator, an op-ed writer. He's a lawyer who builds cases. So I was on the Scott Horton show just yesterday, and I was saying, Glenn would defend anybody, like neo-Nazis who he was proud to take on. And then he dresses us up in the First Amendment. Anyway, maybe Glenn was unwitting, but I think he was probably witting in this whole operation. And I think Edward Snowden got played. I don't know how they did it, but I think Snowden ended up, Glenn is rich and famous, and he's now basically in the Fox News ghetto. But, Edward Snowden is now stuck in Moscow the rest of his life, for as long as Vladimir Putin or Putin's successors let him there. What sort of a life does he lead over there? He got hung out to dry, and they shut down. They obtained all of his documents and released a fraction. When I worked there in 2015, they had bought a safe to lock up the Snowden documents. And now the world is never going to see most of what Snowden leaked and risked his life for, because he could have been executed for treason by Obama or Trump. He risked his life. He's living in Moscow. And I guarantee you, if he wasn't Putin's bitch before he got to Moscow, and if he didn't know he was going to be, he does know now. He may occasionally speak out, and he may occasionally say something to prove that he's not a captive of Putin, but he is very definitely Putin's captive. So anyway, sorry to interrupt you, but I think that I want to add.
No, those are some good points. But I would like to go back to Omidyar for a second. I think one of the main reasons, if your theory about this being set up intentionally by Omidyar as sort of a limited hangout or an intelligence operation of that sort of type, I think that it's worth considering too that based on what I did reporting on this last year, that some NSA whistleblowers have said it's from the past, like Bill Denny and Russell Tice, so that it's very likely that what was contained in the Snowden docs was information that was very incriminating of PayPal, which Pierre Omidyar owns, and showed them working with the NSA and the Treasury Department, and then that was that Omidyar was interested in sort of privatizing those leaks, right? And so that sort of theory, right? So that seems to suggest, right, that there was an interest in sort of buying off Greenwald in particular. And it's interesting to note, right? So we talked about talking about PayPal. So one of the founders of PayPal was Peter Thiel, right?
Yeah, so I was going to mention that. Mm-hmm.
Right, and he went on to found Palantir, and Palantir drafted this document that was called like the WikiLeaks threat or something, and it talked about trying to take out or sort of, sort of neutralize Glenn Greenwald in a not like kill him or anything, but sort of make him choose. I forget the exact phrase, but it was like make him choose his professional career over cause, right? So I think it's interesting the factors here. Right. So I think it's very possible, especially considering that Greenwald makes like $500,000 a year and lives in the mansion of a former hedge fund manager in Rio.
Whitney, hold it, just I have to interrupt. He makes $500,000 officially. Maybe that's been acknowledged. I think he's always, Glenn is always the first to scream about lobbyists and politicians not disclosing their sources of income, but he's considered right. His own track. I can tell you absolutely for sure that he received more than $500,000. He got a big fat bonus, and he got it through a payment to, and I can not say this with 100%, but 99%, through a Florida LLC that he created to launder the money, to hide the tracks. If you look at their early 990 forms, there were huge payments, $500,000 the first year, as I recall, to a Florida LLC for consulting services. I am told by a very, very reliable inside source that was Glenn's payment. So he got $1 million that first year, and I bet he's gotten a lot more through various offshore mechanisms since. But let me emphasize, I'm speculating about since. What I do know is he set up an offshore being Florida, and I'll even hedge that. But if you look at because you've got to go back and look at their 990s, it's a big fat consultant payment. All I know is he was paid what I was told from a very reliable inside source with direct knowledge, a $500,000 bonus the first year. So his salary was double what was disclosed.
What was reported? Well, that's the first I heard of that, but that's unfortunately not surprising. I think also, talking about Greenwald's salary makes the official excuse for why the Snowden document archive was officially closed by the Intercept just really laughable. And I really don't know how people believe that it was closed because of cost. And, when I had a Twitter exchange with Greenwald last year where he was really unfriendly, he really pushed back against these claims, but I think they're really valid questions that really anyone needs to consider, especially when they say it was closed because of cost. It was less than 2% of the entire budget. Pierre Omidyar is worth like $12 billion.
Exactly. Give me a break. It makes 0 sense.
Jeremy Scahill makes like over $300,000 a year officially, and Greenwald makes over $500,000 officially, and they claim they had to close this because of cost. That just seems really dishonest, and I don't know why they think people would believe that, but I guess they didn't really feel like they had any other excuse. Also pointing out, going back to Snowden, apparently Snowden had not even been informed of the decision to close until after the decision was made. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is troubling. But, talking about Snowden, some people have actually argued that he may have been in on it as well, just because of the fact that he hasn't protested how his archive has been handled. I think that's possible, but I really think it's really up in the air. But if you don't want to consider, that possibility, what has happened to the documents that Snowden, ostensibly, made the sacrifice of his personal freedom and to live in exile forever, assumably. The fact that they released less than 10% is troubling, and the fact they didn't even consult him in closing it, also troubling. It's just it's a really unfortunate circumstance. I'm personally surprised Snowden didn't complain more, but maybe he is just really disillusioned. Or maybe with the whole thing. That could be a possibility.
Or maybe he's actually afraid of saying certain things that, I'm literally thinking aloud here. I mean, I think Snowden was set up. I think probably by the Russians. I mean, he did end up in Moscow after all. And I assure you, when he went through Hong Kong, the Chinese got everything he had. Both the Chinese and the Russians have the full Snowden archive. The American people don't because their Intercept bought it and has hidden it. But there's no question the Russians and the Chinese possess everything that Snowden took. One of the two of them probably played him. They, you know, he's a guy who's smart. He's sort of I'm not supposed to say this probably, but an idiot savant. He has a talent in one area, but he doesn't seem like a terribly bright guy. He's not charismatic. He's not, you know, I mean, I can't imagine he was hugely popular during most of his life, but he became a celebrity, which must have been appealing. My guess is he was honeypotted, that a attractive woman offered him a shoulder to cry on and quietly encouraged him to, because he was discontent. He was genuinely outraged. This is a theory. He was genuinely outraged about U.S. foreign policy and wanted to do something, and he thought he was the smartest guy in the room, and he got played. The Russians are experts at honeypotting. I mean, they've done it a million times. I've written about this. I did a 3-part series for Washington Babylon about the possibility that Snowden got played. I could be wrong, but, you know, I don't think, I hope not. I hope this guy was not, you know, in on it from the beginning. I really don't think he was. Somebody set him up. And, you know, was Pierre O'Mara?
Right. I think that's definitely possible, what you're saying. I mean, it's really hard to know because Snowden has been so quiet about all of this that, you know, there's a lot of different theories, and it's really hard to know, you know, which one holds the most water, so to speak. But, you know, I think, you know, whether Snowden was a part or was not is actually kind of irrelevant to the theory that the Intercept was founded to be a limited hangout. And that's because, you know, being a limited hangout, you know, as it's defined, is about, you know, when they can't maintain the secrecy of a government program, they intentionally release some of it to the public, but just enough so that people are so, you know, intrigued by the new info that they don't try and pursue it any further. And let's remember that the biggest stuff to come out of the Snowden leaks, the small portion that was actually published, I mean, less than 10% of this archive was published, right? It was stuff about NSA spying, and though there was definitely new aspects that were expanded in that, the program itself had been revealed by Bill Binney and Russell Tice and other NSA whistleblowers of the past, right? So it wasn't exactly like it was, you know, something totally unknown to the public. And also, it didn't really result in major changes to U.S. policy either. I mean, I think it was just recently, you know, there was coverage of, that program Snowden exposed may finally close, but it was only because the NSA decided to close it itself or something like that, from what I remember. So, I mean, you know, based on what they released, at least in the case of NSA spying, I mean, that really does seem sort of to fit, you know, what would happen if it was in fact founded to be a limited hangout. And this also goes to other the way in which they publish some other documents not related to NSA spying. One of which would be you know, a document they published on the Syrian war. It was one that showed that one rebel group that was being heavily promoted in the by the press at the time that the Snowden documents were released and all that, the Free Syria Army, that it was taking orders directly from Saudi officials, and this was only released after the U.S. government started to be critical of that same group and started to, you know, sort of shy away from their support of that group. It only came after that. Which is interesting. And also, you know, it's also considered to the Intercept on Syria issues is also teamed up with Bellingcat of Elliot Higgins, right? So, I mean, I think that should tell you a lot.
It tells you.
And a lot of their reporting on Syria, I mean, they've given people, I mean, there was one article on Syria they published by some girl. It was her first article, and she didn't even get, like, the death toll right. She, like, greatly exaggerated the death toll and got, like, basic facts about the conflict super wrong, and none of the editors caught that, which ties back into your experience about what you wrote for Politico, because I cited that in some of my investigations about the Intercept from last year, about how they weren't interested in the actual journalism at all. Based on your experiences and things like that, and the editors were really disorganized and things like that. I mean, the fact they let something that big slip is Yeah, I don't know. It's pretty telling. And the fact that, this girl didn't really have much experience, also telling. But there's also another leak that they didn't publish until after it was irrelevant, and that was the fact that the NSA was trying to illegally track down users of Bitcoin, which is interesting because Ross Ulbricht, who was in prison right now because of the whole Silk Road thing, his defense, which was ultimately unsuccessful, was claiming that the FBI story of how it identified him didn't add up, and they argued that the NSA had helped them penetrate Silk Road servers illegally because of Bitcoin use. And they lost the case in just like a couple months. It might have been actually only a month. He was, after Ulbricht was sentenced to life in prison, then they publish a Snowden document that shows that, in fact, the NSA was actually doing what Ulbricht's defense said they were doing.
Right.
A combination of that and the outing of whistleblowers, and the hiring of people like Matthew Cole, after they were known to blow out their whistleblowers, is just really troubling.
Really troubling. I've got to cut you off. I hate to do this, but I've got to bring this segment to a close. I want to have you back on again soon. I would, I'll give you 1 minute. My last minute is, I would just say that we have a situation where, at minimum, you have a publication that has set a record for putting whistleblowers in prison, a publication that was set up to do fearless, independent, adversarial journalism and to help whistleblowers. At minimum, it is an incompetent organization that has spent more money than you and I and our publications can ever spend in a lifetime, and produced extraordinarily little. So even if everything we've suggested, some of it which we know to be true, but if my theory that it's an intel operation is wrong, it's still a shit media organization that should be shut down and closed. Now, you've got 1 minute, and we've got to bring this to an end.
Okay, sure. Well, something I'd like to stress is that the myth that's been built around the Intercept, that it's fearless and adversarial and all of this, and why Pierre Midyar founded it, which was the claim that he, saw the light and wanted to protect press freedom and all this stuff. I mean, it's total bunk. We know that now, not only because of the shutting of the archive, but also because Pierre Midyar has been founding Bill Kristol, of all people, funding Hamilton 68. And Kristol used some of that money to found the successor to the Weekly Standard, the Bulwark. So the fact that you would have someone, wanting to fund progressive adversarial journalism and then turning around and funding the editor-in-chief of the Weekly Standard in his new publication. I mean, for anyone with a brain, it's really clear that Pierre Midyar's reasons for getting involved are absurd. And the fact that Greenwald, continues to play dumb and claims he doesn't care about Midyar's political connections and all this stuff is really telling, and shows that he doesn't really want to be accountable and doesn't really want it to be his problem. Or the fact that he's complicit. It's really any of those things.
Exactly.
And it remains to be seen how many other staff members of the Intercept are either on the side of being complicit or, unwittingly involved in this.
Or were unwitting and then realized, because the evidence is just so overwhelming now, that they still prefer to keep their big salaries than to quit.
Right.
Which is the right thing to do. Well, look, we've got to bring this to a close. It was great to have you on. I want to have you back on because something tells me this story is not going to be dead as of today.
No, I don't think so either.
And keep building. What's funny is I really am sick of the Intercept. I quit in disgust, and it took me a while to get over it. I felt like, I'd been through war or something. It was just a traumatic experience. But I moved on with my life, and I decided pretty much to stop writing about them. And then the problem is that people keep coming to me with stories. And now, this is just, it's a snowball effect, or whatever. You know what I mean? It's just like, the evidence just keeps piling up. And I think this is going to become a bigger and bigger scandal. And the truth is going to come out, as it invariably does. So thank you.
Yeah, well, it seems to already be coming out, so I hope that happens. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about the Intercept anytime.
Thank you. We'll have you back on for sure.
Tú, son los mismos.
Ahora compartes mi secreto y mi compromiso de amor.
Los amo tanto.
The following has been produced as part of a crowdfunding campaign for the website Washington Babylon. edited by the investigative journalist Ken Silverstein. If you would like to support Ken's investigation, visit patreon.com/DCBabylon. That's patreon.com/DCBabylon.
It's common to find corrupt members of Congress, but Senator Marco Rubio, really, I can't think of anyone dirtier. Going back to his early days, his brother-in-law, as I recall, was a coke trafficker, and young Marco, as a teenager, used to, as I recall, walk the dogs and mow the lawn of the brother-in-laws. The thing is, you could say, well, he was just the dog walker or the lawnmower, but this was a major coke trafficker, and little Marco never noticed anything funny. I mean, they were dealing a ton of, well, I don't want to say 2,000 pounds. It probably was more. I don't really know. It was a major drug trafficking operation, and little Marco was too goddamn stupid to notice anything, or maybe he did notice something, and they paid him, $100 an hour to walk the dogs. I mean, I can't answer that question, but that's one of the things I'm going to be looking at. There are so many. He has a long-time association with one of the most crooked individuals in the state of Florida. And when you say one of the most crooked individuals in the state of Florida, I mean, I don't even know what compares to that. I mean, in the city of New Orleans, I mean, in the city of Chicago, in the outer circles of hell, David Rivera, they are long-time party friends, love to party, love to go out on the town and have a good time, love to consort with lobbyists. He's a family man, so I would not want to cast aspersions on he or Mr. Rivera. However, if one were to do a Google search, one would find some very interesting things. I've written a few things about Mr. Rubio. I won't call him Senator Rubio. That's a degraded term as it is. But this is a guy who, I wrote a story for the New York Observer. Anybody can Google my name, Marco Rubio, and I did a few stories, but one in particular will come up about his real estate transactions, where, let's just say he obtained his first house. I think he had 3 houses. I can't remember how many lady friends. Just friends. I mean, not saying they were girlfriends or lovers. I'm just saying they were intimate companions. Good family man. So I wouldn't want to suggest in any way there was more than that. But you can read my New York Observer piece where he declined comment on anything having to do with how he obtained housing, his homes very, 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 very cheaply, and always managed to make money on these real estate transactions where campaign donors or bankers he knew or people who might, again, I don't want to cast aspersions, but people who might want favors from Mr. Rubio helped him out. There was a crooked doctor involved in one of these transactions, a Medicare fraudster. He's got a lot of interesting friends. And he had no comment about this. I mean, if I were called and said, are you a crook? And do you like to party with David Rivera? And do you have some intimate lobbyist female companions? I don't care personally what people do in their private lives, but if you're a U.S. senator, as Mr. Rubio is, a lot of what he does has the appearance of impropriety. So I'll be looking into the dirty, dirty past of this man, but I'll be also focusing on his disgusting role as the chief cheerleader and sponsor of the attempt to overthrow the government of Venezuela. I mean, I would say the 3 most powerful individuals all should be rotting in jail cells are Rubio, John Bolton, and Elliot Abrams. And Rubio was there first. I mean, Trump ultimately bears responsibility for the criminal sanctions that are punishing the people of Venezuela, strangling the country, and not harming the leadership. And no question, there is serious corruption among the leadership in the Venezuelan government. I mean, that's not even open to question. However, they're not hurting President Maduro in any way. I understand why the Venezuelan people are tired and exhausted, and they are not happy necessarily with President Maduro. But I have been to Venezuela a few months ago, and I'll be going back as part of my reporting, in addition to going down to Florida. So we very definitely need to raise some money for this story. And, you know, the situation there, I'm not going to say it's 100% the cause of the United States, but you read newspaper stories where they say the people are starving. Well, the government does give a monthly food basket to everybody in the poor areas, which is most of the country. I saw it with my own eyes and wrote about it at Washington Babylon, Caracas Chronicles. If you Google that and Washington Babylon, you'll find this story. You'll find pictures. I was in the poor areas where I was, you know, fed, well taken care of. I'm not going to say Venezuela is a paradise. Of course it's not. It's a very difficult situation. It's complicated, but if there's any man who is evil in regard to his conduct towards Venezuela, it's Marco Rubio. I mean, you have to sort of wonder, because he's, you know, famously, his family were Cuban fascists, anti-Castro, but I don't know why he's got a hard-on for Venezuela. I mean, and this is one of the things I'll be looking at. Something's there, you know. Maybe he took some dirty money, speculation, of course, from a Venezuelan businessman close to the government and got burned on the deal. I don't know what his obsession is. And lastly, I am also going to be focusing on his best friend in Venezuela, Leopoldo Lopez, praised in the U.S. media as a hero and a freedom fighter. I can guarantee you this guy is going to look very, very ugly when I'm done with my reporting. His family is extremely rich. They own a lot of property. I don't believe all that property was obtained legally or that they've disclosed the ownership of it. And Leopoldo Lopez is a party goer just like Marco Rubio. You know, Marco used to mow the lawn for coke traffickers. I don't know. I mean, I've just heard stories. It may have just been NyQuil, but, you know, from what I understand, Mr. Lopez, the Trump administration's bitch in Venezuela, and Marco Rubio's God knows what, potentially a business partner, who the hell knows. They are not going to be happy with what I report. That's what I can guarantee you. I can't guarantee you I'll uncover every stone and find every fact, but I will guarantee you that Marco Rubio, Donald Trump, John Bolton, Elliot Abrams, and Leopoldo Lopez are going to be pissed off when they see my reporting. All I'm looking for is $1,200 because I know everybody's pressed for money. That's not even going to cover my costs. I'm looking for money elsewhere. I'm trying to find a sponsor that'll pay for my plane ticket to Venezuela. I mean, there's $1,200. You know, the expenses aren't going to come close. I got to go to Florida. I'm happy to do it. It's going to be a great reporting trip. Down to Miami, possibly Tallahassee, and to Caracas. So that's not going to be, you know, at $1,200, I'm going to lose. But I'm going to raise other money, and we'll publish some great stories at Washington Babylon, and I'll probably publish a few stories elsewhere to make money, because I got to hustle. Because, as you know, journalism is not the most profitable profession unless you are, well, like a lot of our U.S. journalists, not terribly critical or skeptical or honest. And that's, you know, the fastest route to success. But we try to do a little bit better at Washington Babylon.
Preceding has been produced as part of a crowdfunding campaign for the website Washington Babylon, edited by the investigative journalist Ken Silverstein. Music credits are as follows. The songs Hacienda and Cory were produced and distributed by the website Filmstro, while The Internationale was produced by Jerry Engelbach. All music has been used in this package on the basis of properly recognized and adhered to licenses with their creators. If you would like to support Ken's investigation, visit patreon.com/DCBabylon. That's patreon.com/DCBABYLON.
Aunque sea mi hijo predilecto, ha violado la ley.
Next up is a conversation between Ken and Corey Pein, a reporter who has been working on a variety of issues in his journalism over the past several years.
Hey, Cory, it's good to have you on. We haven't spoken for a while, actually. I've been traveling. You moved.
Yes.
What are you up to these days?
Well, right now I'm working on a story for the New Republic about the militant left, and it's some who are organizing or arming up in response to whatever violence from the right or fears of Trump sort of not conceding or cracking down in some fashion. So that's the sum of my magazine work, apart from a deadline that I'm like a year behind on about UFOs, and I'm trying to figure out what my next book's going to be. So it'll probably be one of those two topics, which I've sunk a lot of time into.
Well, are you allowed to say anything more? I mean, Chris Lehman is a mutual friend. I don't want to have him be mad at me, but can you tell us? I'm just curious if you can quickly, without giving the whole story away. Are you suggesting that the militant left is justified in arming up, or that they're a bunch of loons, or something in between?
Yeah, my brief is to do reporting rather than advocacy, and there's a mix of loons and people who come off as pretty level-headed, and are comfortable with guns, and this is their response. That said, I have a lot of questions about it, and I think the risks may outweigh any benefits, especially considering who currently has all the guns in the U.S. Right. It's all the forces that would be arrayed against those people. So, I think it's too complex and scary, frankly, of a question to have easy answers for. I'm just really hoping to introduce people to some of the groups that are doing this and the different points of view that they represent and the problems they've had, or the problems that arise. We lost a friend recently, actually, after I started working on this piece. My wife worked for some years with Lyra McKee, who was the journalist that was shot in Northern Ireland a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. And that was an armed left-wing group that was just firing pot shots at police. And wow. She got hit and killed. And, I think one of the main differences that you would see in a similar situation if you were to try to transpose it onto the U.S. is that the police wouldn't hesitate in shooting back, which they did hesitate and did not fire back in Northern Ireland. So, prevented a situation from escalating into something much worse. But I don't think that's what you'd see in the U.S. if you saw some of the things that happened in the 60s and 70s happening again, like Black Panthers marching with guns. I don't think that the police would show restraint in the U.S. And it's a volatile situation. So really, all I'm trying to do is give people the outlines of it, rather than in this piece, take a stand on what the right thing to do is. The certainty is that the right is well armed, increasingly violent, and indulging in a lot of very scary Civil War rhetoric. So, I think that has to be reckoned with. whether you think guns are a terrible idea or, something that people have a right to wield in self-defense. So that's kind of where I'm at with that. Yeah.
So just to ask the obvious, impossible question for you to answer. I mean, where's this all heading? I mean, one school of thought could be that, the United States has seen during its history the rise of extremist groups. I mean, almost always on the right. The Weathermen were, on the left. I mean, there have been on the right and left, but typically on the right. Hey, we've never, ended up in a really scary situation, although actually I probably am forgetting a few things. But I mean, are we heading towards unprecedented turf where we really see large scale militancy on both sides and violence in the streets between, the far right and, let's say, the militant left? Because I'm personally much more sympathetic to. I'm much more sympathetic to the left. Politically, I am on the left. People sometimes get confused, but I understand. Actually, I can empathize with. I think you know way more about this than me. You're writing an article and possibly a book about it. I've met plenty of loons on the left who I don't trust with guns. On the other hand,
absolutely.
But on the other hand, the situation in this country is so outlandish, and there are right-wing, white nationalist groups that are arming up, and the economic situation, and I'm going to get to this a little later, is so dire for most people, something that virtually the entire journalism class misses. You have desperate people, and so I'm much more sympathetic to people on the left arming up than I am to people on the right. Not that I think that that's an ideal solution, but I get it. I mean, if there comes a time when people are out on the streets throwing rocks, I'll probably be out there if they're on the left. On the right, that scares me more. But what I'm asking is, are we heading towards a situation where we may see, not routine, but increasing clashes between militant right and militant left, whatever one thinks of either side? Are we heading in that direction?
I think so. I mean, you're already seeing those clashes. I covered them pretty extensively when I was in Portland because it was sort of a hot spot, right? Portland, Berkeley, a few other places. But, people are bringing guns to those kind of things. It's just they're not necessarily getting drawn, although that occasionally does happen. And when the really concerning thing is, I think people on the left are particularly concerned about this, and I think rightfully so, is when you see the police sort of looking the other way at violence from the right and being extremely concerned about any hint of it on the left, and certainly meeting it with disproportionate force. That's particularly true when you see groups like the Black Panthers or the Brown Berets. Right. Exercising their Second Amendment rights. I think that's undoubtedly going to happen. I think that my task is to not overstate the size or extent, or certainly the threat posed by the militant left, because there isn't really one in the U.S. Yeah. I think we might be talking about what I was trying to get at. Hundreds or thousands, low thousands of people tops, and whereas on the right, it's hard to just get estimates of the paramilitary right, but the credible estimates I've heard are more in the high tens or hundreds of thousands of right wingers armed up and have been training for years or maybe decades to conduct their purge of the liberals. My big concern is that not necessarily that we'll see a lot of street clashes, whether or not they involve the police, National Guard, or whatever, but that there will be a genocide, which, again, is not unprecedented in the U.S. or the Americas. But I think in many ways, certainly by the United Nations legal definition, it's already begun. I mean, the family separation policy is a genocidal policy, according to the way that is described by the United Nations. So,
can you elaborate on that? Because I mean, people will hear the word genocide and think, oh, this is like crazy talk. I don't, but I think there are some people who hear that word and will say, family separation policy equals genocide. What the hell is this guy talking about? So what are you talking about?
Look, I'll just read one paragraph. I've just pulled up the UN website, un.org, and they've got a special advisor on the prevention of genocide within the organization. And the thing at the top of the document I'm looking at is called Legal Definition of Genocide. And it says, genocide is defined in Article 2 on the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide of 1948 as, quote, any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And those latter two, I think, are the ones that specifically pertain to the child separation policy. But, arguably the whole statute applies. I mean, you've got border militias on the right working with Border Patrol to, round up people by the dozens or hundreds that they find crossing the desert. And, the quote that came out of one of these episodes the other day was a guy saying we need to go back to the Hitler days. So I think there's genocidal intent. And there's, according to this legal definition, genocidal actions. I think, the thing that we need to be concerned with is how can we stem this from getting worse? And that's where, start to flounder, because it certainly seems like the Republican Party is fully committed to this policy. Yeah. And there's nobody, you can't count on the police to protect. Like we're talking about it's a mestizo genocide mainly, and you can't count on, the American police forces or the military now, which has been deployed to the border to protect those people from, their destruction.
Right. Well, you've answered the question really, really well. And I mean, at this point, anybody listening, I think, can no longer say you're a wild man. I mean, that's a really, really good answer to the question I posed.
Could I ask a question?
Around a little bit. I'm sorry.
It's Andrew here. I was wondering if I could just ask Cory a quick question.
Yes,
sure.
So my interaction as it's been with the people on the left who are in favor of creating a left-wing gun culture, there's a certain understanding of COINTELPRO and the history of state repression of the left and, for example, the targeting of the old Communist Party in the McCarthy period on the basis of the claim that they wanted to violently overthrow the government, which was never actually the case, but that was what they sent people to jail on. And so I'm wondering if you've dealt with or encountered folks who comprehend and grapple with that discussion.
I think most of the people I've talked to are keenly aware of that kind of thing. And I remember the first time I dropped in, not saying DSA is one of these groups, it's certainly not, although some people in DSA are thinking along these lines. The first time I went to a DSA meeting in Portland, just to sort of see what was going on, I remember this big crowded union hall and a guy standing up in the back of the room when question time was like, so are we going to seize arms and overthrow the government or what? And it was just like, that's not what this is about, guy. And I asked some people about it later, and they all assume that that's a cop, right? So and that repeats again and again, particularly in, these sort of West Coast circles where there have been almost 2 years of street confrontations now. And people have had time not just to read up on the history of COINTELPRO, but to sort of experience those tactics themselves. But there is a lot of ignorance and a lot of, I think, the bigger thing that stands out to me is people who really underestimate what they're up against in terms of the power of the government, the U.S. government. But
what do you mean, Cory?
Well, just in terms of the amount of force it can bring to bear, or the many ways that it can make your life difficult in a legal context if it decides it doesn't like you. And, that's even not even getting into this whole question of provocateurs and infiltrators and all of that. I mean, that is certainly going on. I'm confident enough in my reporting over these past couple of years to say that's definitely going on, but not to the level where I can write it up in an article and say, here's the snitch and here's what happens in great detail. But, it'll probably take 20 years for that kind of information to come out. The other thing that's sort of underpinning all this is, the increased stress on every aspect of the society from climate change and the economy, as you mentioned, and climate change is going to affect the economy. So I think we're going to see, more bad behavior all around. That's what I'm afraid of. And, as far as the immediate risk of these people being targeted, I don't think anybody, whether it's some kind of, in New Zealand after Christchurch, you saw some Maori biker gangs like going to the mosques and protecting them, right? And I don't remember if they were carrying firearms or not, but that aside, we're talking about big guys that are pretty rough and tumble. So, that's a bit of a deterrent. And, that's something, but I haven't seen anything like that at scale. Even the sort of sanctuary movement of liberal and left-wing faith groups is pretty outside the mainstream and not gain a lot of traction despite all the deportations and the concentration camps that are popping up on the border. I'm afraid that nobody's really going to step up and protect these people from all the harm that sort of white majority America is prepared to inflict on them.
Right. Listen, I want to shift ground for a second
Sure.
because we're very late in promoting your great book, Live, Work, Die, A Journey into the Savage Heart of Silicon Valley. But nonetheless, I mean, that was a great book, and everybody should read it. It's one of the best books about Silicon Valley I've ever read. You mentioned something about people underestimating the role of the state. And in my view, the tech oligarchy is emerging, that has emerged and now is just extraordinarily powerful. It rivals and interlocks with Wall Street in terms of its power. And it's scary to me when you talk about the power of the state, because you've got this alliance between the tech companies and the government that is utterly terrifying in a very, very different way. I mean, typically we think of the state as being repressive in, sending out troops or, Kent State or on and on and on, sending out military force. But now it's this much quieter sort of repression and stifling of voices, which we definitely, little us at Washington Babylon, have had all sorts of mysterious problems. I mean, all of my posts from 2016 on disappeared on Facebook when I started writing about Venezuela. And I've had similar problems after writing about Hezbollah. And now people may think I'm crazy because now my posts are visible again. But I went, I think, a month or 6 weeks where people were saying, your posts are no longer visible. I noticed because I have close to 5,000 friends on Facebook, and I mean, maybe I'm not very clever, but normally 1 or 2 people or 20 or sometimes 30 or 40, and sometimes if I got lucky, 100 would like a post. And then I noticed nobody liked anything. It's like, so
I've experienced that as well. I mean, you might well be paranoid, but it doesn't mean that kind of thing doesn't happen. I think the most innocuous explanation is that, I mean, certainly with things like Venezuela and Hezbollah, they may be using keywords, or maybe Washington Babylon wound up on some extremism list, like a lot of other good websites, unjustly. And that could be going on. But really, Facebook has taken great steps to promote things that it deems as either so controversial that people must interact with it and argue with each other on their platform, or so incontroversial, like baby pictures and vacation photos and things like that, that people just interact with it because, to say congratulations or I'm jealous or whatever. Right. It's completely inoffensive. So it could just be that. And I think in my case, that's what's happened, because I post rarely there, but I tend to post whatever political stuff or links to news articles. And I just think Facebook doesn't care about that kind of stuff. It's not what it sees its mission as. And they don't want to necessarily, like, riling people up is okay for them, but they don't want to bum people out, because then they'll go do something else. So,
but they have, I mean, for certain, allowed some outside organizations to serve. There's a fact-checked industrial complex emerging in our country where, groups like the Atlantic Council and various other entities, which are very mainstream and will tend to be from the most moderate left and then onward to the right. They don't have a broad range of opinions. They have allowed outside groups to intrude into deeming what's acceptable opinion, not just Facebook, all the big tech platforms or social media platforms. I'm sorry.
My read on what happened with that kind of effort, and I don't think it was ever a genuine effort on Facebook's part, was that it was basically like the Democrats were mad at them for perceived unfairness or allowing some kind of manipulation in 2016, tilting the election against them. And the way that Facebook responded to that was to appoint the kind of people that, powerful Democrats deem to be good arbiters, which would be like the Atlantic Council or something, right? Or New America or any number of,
right.
Sort of milquetoast NGO type outfits. And
yeah, exactly.
People who've been involved in those kind of efforts or suckered by Facebook's promise that they will, try to do the right thing for the society or the discourse or whatever. Their perspective after going through the ringer there is that it's all just a PR exercise. Facebook doesn't really care about any of it. And I think, based on my reporting, if there's anything I learned from the book, it's that I went too easy on these techies. I mean, especially the really powerful ones like Bezos and Jack Dorsey and Zuckerberg. I mean, they are extremist in their own views. I mean, they have an extremist conception of the free market being an ideal and of a very narrow conception of free speech and what it means. I mean, I take great offense to the way that the free speech conversation is developed in the U.S. as someone who has worked in countries with formal censorship, and really stuck up for free speech my entire adult life and career, to be told that, free speech means tolerating hate speech in all areas. I mean, I think that's a ridiculous argument. All the same, I don't necessarily trust the government, and certainly not these companies, to decide what's legitimate and what's not. So but their conception of free speech is one that really jibes well with a new sort of fascist trend on the right. And I expect that they're going to continue in that vein, because again, we're talking, as you pointed out, we're talking about oligarchs here. We're talking about people who have, economic and political interests of their own, and you can't take anything they say at face value. And so they're going to use whatever power they have to, cement their status and make sure that what they see is desirable direction for the world gets heard and enacted. So, I don't buy it when they say that, they're neutral in their way of approaching this, or that they don't favor one group over another. They certainly do. And any efforts they've made to, mitigate the spread of Nazi propaganda, for example, is purely as a result of pressure from Democrats and the left. It's not because they think it's the right thing to do. And that's the main difference. even at my college newspaper, we knew you didn't take money to run like Holocaust denial ads, right? But we made a journalistic and moral choice there, and that's exactly what the ideology of these tech oligarchs prohibits. They don't consider themselves as people who have any responsibility in that area, and they don't believe in morality. They believe in money, and it's the last people you'd want sort of in an influential position over journalism or the public conversation. They're ideologues with a great self-interest.
Right. Well, let me ask you something that's dear to my heart, and I know to yours. What I view as the dire state of American journalism. And do you see a connection between the rise of the tech oligarchy and what I think you will agree is a pretty pathetic state of journalism?
Yeah, absolutely. Sort of I think it's that, when I started reporting the book, it was, I'm not sure where to draw a hard line when I started, but, most of the reporting began in earnest in 2014. And at that time, I would say it was still the dominant view in the dying journalism industry that, tech would be a savior in a way. That, you could have partnerships with a company like Facebook, and you could just sort of tweak your approach to a way that satisfies Google or Twitter, and expand your audience, and somehow come up with a business model that will, keep your organization afloat. And I think not so many people believe that these days. And it's not because of my book. I would love to take credit for that. It's because they have all been burned, and part of what I tell in the book is the story of how I got burned, because I used to think that way, I still, I don't work for newspapers anymore. I do occasional magazine work, and I do a podcast. So I'm part of the tech economy, and it's completely stacked against not just journalists, but independent artists and creators of any type. It's a monopolistic machine, the internet. I mean, by design, it favors monopoly.
Well, hold it. Okay, I really, really want you to elaborate on that, because I feel the same way, but you know a lot more about it. And I want you to expand on that issue. Why is it stacked? Because some people will just say, "Oh, Cory and Ken, you're just losers, and Andrew, you're a loser." You just can't compete against real journalists like Ezra Klein. How is the system stacked against people like us? And, why is it that someone as bland and boring and utterly conventional as Ezra Klein is, how does he succeed? I mean, we know roughly where his funding comes from. And I'm asking, the second part of this question is pretty obvious, clearly, but can you talk about that? I mean, how is it that, how is the system stacked against independent reporting? I know that sounds dumb, but I actually can't answer that question as well as you can, I'm quite sure.
There's 1,000 different ways, and, I do get into some of them in detail in the book, but, I think the largest reason is one that actually goes directly to the free market ideology that is behind a lot of these platforms, behind the venture capital industry, and certainly behind the sort of internet evangelists. And that is that, if you're doing independent reporting on issues of public concern, back in the old days at newspapers, right, they would call that like the vegetables on the menu, right? I mean, this is stuff that is not necessarily going to draw as large of an audience as the candy, or dessert, right? Right. So if your idea of communication is that everything should be on this theoretically even platform, and it's not even, and I could go on and on about that, but let's just say that, they've created a platform where everybody has an equivalent voice, although that's not true, but that's the idea. Somebody who's doing a bunch of work, and investing a bunch of money into doing independent journalism, say, funding a trip to Venezuela or whatever it may be, investigating.
Which is what I'm up to right now, having just returned a few months ago and planning to go back and trying to raise money for that. So thank you for letting me promote that in case anybody wants to give Washington Babylon money to fund that. But keep going. Sorry, I had to interrupt.
As you know, the real work is really expensive and time consuming. And then when you're done with it and you're ready to show the world what you've uncovered, whether you're Ken Silverstein or Seymour Hersh or Corey Pein or whoever, you're not going to get as big of a crowd as someone who's, reporting on celebrities or whatever. And that's just how it is. In some ways that's human nature, but it's a free market ideology that says that's how it has to be on our service. And that's how we have to design our communications. And so journalism has suffered just from that tendency. And then there's the fact that you create all these incentives when you have this sort of supposed level playing field for somebody to take the work that you've done as an independent journalist. I used to run into this all the time when I was running a investigative reporting website on the military industrial complex. I would do a ton of work on my own to get my article up. If I was lucky, it would go viral, which in that context meant, not hundreds of thousands or millions of views, but maybe tens of thousands of views. And if I was lucky, I would get it to go viral. And then what would happen is another organization or an aggregator would come in, take the work I'd done, use their much larger audience that they've gained through fair means or foul to take the work, republish it, and I get no compensation for that. Right? That's not how the economics worked under the old system. If you had a publication, a newspaper, magazine, radio show, TV show, whatever, and you uncovered something through your own, investment and work, and you brought it to people, they'd have to come see it on your terms. That's what not just the laws protect, but the actual infrastructure of the media, and that's changed. So that's probably the biggest way that the mere fact of the existence of the internet or the dominance of the internet has disadvantaged journalism. And there's a lot more ways to address that than have been put forward. I actually think you could rewrite some of the protocols of the internet to make sure that if Washington Babylon broke a big story, everybody who looked at the story at Washington Babylon would in some way contribute and make sure you got paid properly, right? Or if somebody ripped off your story, that would get flagged in the same way that a pirated video does. But, that's all sort of blue sky stuff. We're dealing with a much grimmer situation now. It'd be nice to be able to fix those things, but the internet is what it is at this point, and it is dominated by some early movers who got a lot of venture capital money and were able to carve out massive stakes. I was just saying on Twitter the other day, I think eventually Amazon will make a move to acquire Google, and when the time is right, Google won't fight it because everybody will make money, and that's the kind of morality and system that gave us this amazing oligarch-dominated internet and culture. And it's everything now. When I started the book, one of my questions was, you're right to sort of tie Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and the government. And I was trying to answer the question in my own head of, is Silicon Valley more powerful than Wall Street, or is it just trying to be more powerful? And could it ever be? And I think their ambition is certainly to be more powerful. There's some good reporting about Amazon lately about how much they affect the market for all of these goods that are available on Amazon, which is basically everything nowadays. And at a certain point, as they expand their market share, monopolize, as some have put it, they're trying to monopolize commerce. If they can ever succeed in that or come close to it, then we need to start thinking about them as more like a governmental entity and less like a company. Because one of the things that governments have theoretically reserved for themselves, apart from, the monopoly on violence, is, the right to dictate the terms of commerce. And if you have a company that's become so large that it can effectively do that, then you've got, the devolution in government power. And you have a system that looks less like the kind of corporate capitalism that we've gotten used to and more like a feudal system, where you've got these lords in charge of various companies, and they're supplying essentially everything to people who are their loyal subjects, right? I mean, Amazon already has a labor market that they own called Mechanical Turk, which I talk about a bit in the book. But if you're not familiar with it, it's a place you can go and sign up to do basically piecework, digital piecework, like filling out password forms and things like that for fractions of a cent for every time you do it. So, that philosophy of breaking labor down into, smaller and smaller parts that can be automated is really what animates Silicon Valley today. And it's something that they're trying to apply to every aspect of the society, which is why Uber and Lyft drivers are currently striking, because they've essentially been that entire industry, moving people from one place to another has been completely the aspects of it that allowed for any amount of economic security by the workers has been dismantled by Silicon Valley's approach. So that's happened to journalism as well, and that's another reason why the quality of it is degraded so much, I think.
Right. Well, I'm really proud to say that as we were having this conversation, my daughter, who I'm meeting for dinner shortly, and hence we have to draw this conversation to an end, texted me to say, I certainly hope you're not taking Uber or Lyft today because of the strike. And I told her, I hate driving actually, but it's probably going to rain, so I'm going to drive instead of walking to meet her for dinner. But I do want to give Andrew the last question, and then we need to draw this to a close because I've got to go meet my daughter. But Cory, I could talk to you all night long. We're going to have to do that whenever you're my way or I'm your way next time.
Yeah, well, I should have you on.
Okay. Yeah. So, Cory, you just were talking about this convergence potentially of the right and the Silicon Valley titans. So what's your take on the censorship of Alex Jones and how he was purged from all social media?
Yeah, I'll say that I just did a parody show of Art Bell on my own podcast, and I should have you on again, Ken. That's what I was going to say.
I would from love to be on again.
But I did an Art Bell parody, and I was listening to a lot of Art Bell, and I was thinking, like, I wish that the conspiracy, talk programs of the current day had his sort of heart. And Alex has really turned out to be a pretty destructive force. I mean, if I was running YouTube or Facebook, I would have kicked him off too, because he's for the moral reasons that I was talking about. I mean, the Sandy Hook stuff alone was just pretty despicable. So I think they were within their rights to boot him. Now, I'm aware of this conversation about, is this censorship? And in some ways, it is a modern form of censorship, right? I think that the people who are concerned about that, and to a degree I am, because I make my living on these things, and they could decide I'm an extremist or whatever. Our concern should be to break up the monopolies, because that way the censorship concern is mitigated, and anybody that runs a website still isn't obliged to host content that they find objectionable. And that's really the ultimate counter argument to Alex's whining, is nobody's obliged to host him. And I think that a lot of the way that the right has redefined free speech is to say, free speech means that you have to pay us to spread our, toxic nonsense, and you're not allowed to criticize us. That's what a lot of the debates amount to these days. So I can't say I have a lot of sympathy for Alex. I think he brought it upon himself. And at the same time, I don't want to see any one company, 3 companies, 10 companies be able to dictate what kind of information people have access to. So in a very limited sense, he's right that Google, Facebook, and all these outfits that have given him the boot are, abusing their power. But he's not right that he has a right to, make money spreading his nonsense on any platform that he feels like he deserves access to. That's just not how the First Amendment works. And I don't think that's how it should work, frankly.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next week. This is the Washington Babylon Podcast, hosted by Ken Silverstein and produced by Andrew Stewart.